It was the summer of 1991. Flight 702, a routine passenger flight, took off from Jakarta, bound for Sydney. On board were 200 people, businessmen, students, families, children clutching toys, newlyweds still glowing from their honeymoon. The aircraft, a massive wide-body jet, gleamed as it rolled down the runway. No one on board could have known that they were stepping into history. Not as travelers, but as the faces of one of aviation's most enduring mysteries. Before we dive in, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. It really helps us keep bringing you more stories like this. The flight departed under clear skies. Air traffic control confirmed radio contact as the aircraft climbed smoothly to cruising altitude. The captain, Richard Hall, was a seasoned pilot with over 18,000 flight hours. His voice over the radio was calm, professional, steady. Everything was routine. But 2 hours into the journey, somewhere over the deep expanse of the Timor Sea, all contact was lost. 1 minute, Flight 702 was reporting smooth conditions. The next, silence. Radar showed a blip, then nothing. The plane had simply vanished. Search teams were mobilized within hours. Naval ships swept the waters. Aircraft scanned thousands of square miles. Families were told it was likely the plane had crashed into the ocean. But as days turned into weeks, nothing was found. No debris, no oil slick, not a single life jacket or seat cushion. It was as though the sky had swallowed 200 people whole. For the families, hope turned into torment. Some believed their loved ones had survived somewhere remote, waiting to be found. Others clung to anger, accusing governments of hiding the truth. Rumors spread of hijacking of secret cargo, of something darker at play. The official report labeled it, presumed lost at sea, but the world wasn't convinced. Years passed. The mystery of Flight 702 became a wound that never healed. Parents grew old without answers. Children grew up without closure. Every anniversary, families gathered at memorials, staring out at the endless ocean, asking the same question, where's the plane? Then in 2016, 25 years later, that question was finally answered. It was deep in the jungles of Papua, New Guinea. A logging crew, cutting through dense rainforest, stumbled upon something massive, half buried in vines and earth. At first, they thought it was just a rusting metal structure left behind by miners decades ago. But as they cleared the vegetation, the truth revealed itself. The torn fuselage of a passenger plane. Faded letters still clung to the metal. Flight 702. The world erupted. After 25 years, the missing plane had been found. But the discovery raised more questions than answers. Because this was not the ocean. This was not the sea. This was thousands of miles from where the plane had vanished. And what investigators found inside would change everything. When the first images of the wreckage surfaced, the world froze. The metal body of Flight 702 lay tilted on its side, swallowed by jungle roots and heavy vines. The nose was shattered against a cliff face, but much of the fuselage was still intact. Paint peeled like dead skin, the once bright red stripe along its body now a ghostly pink under the tropical sun. Investigators arrived within days. Journalists swarmed the area, helicopters circling above the canopy. For the families of the missing, hope and dread collided in their hearts. After all this time, would they finally have answers? The team entered through a gash in the fuselage. Inside was a time capsule from 1991. Rows of seats were still bolted to the floor, covered in moss and rot. Overhead bins hung open, some spilling faded clothes and rusted metal. Passports, wallets, and children's toys lay scattered where they had fallen. A teddy bear, soaked and stiff with mildew, sat upright in the seat, as though still waiting for its owner. But the strangest detail was the silence. For all the devastation, there were no human remains in the wreckage, no bones, no traces of the 200 passengers who should have been there. It was as if the people had vanished into thin air before the crash. The black box was recovered, remarkably well preserved. Engineers worked for weeks to restore its data. When they finally powered it on, the final moments of Flight 702 came back to life. At 10:47 p.m., the captain's voice was calm as he spoke, to air traffic control. Then, suddenly, alarms blared in the cockpit, warning lights flashing. An unknown emergency had triggered. The co-pilot's voice, tense but controlled, asked if they should divert. Then, in the recording, a new voice emerged, not from the cockpit crew, but from someone else, someone inside the cabin, a man shouting. Chaos erupted in the background. The captain yelled, "Get them out of here!" Then the tape cut into static. The investigation took a darker turn. Flight 702 had not suffered a simple mechanical failure. It had been hijacked. But by who? And why? And if the plane crashed here, in the jungle, what happened to the 200 people on board? The jungle kept its secrets. But hidden deep inside the wreckage, investigators found something chilling. Scratched into the metal wall near the back of the plane were words carved with desperate hands. "We are alive. Help us." The words scratched into fuselage sent shockwaves through the investigation. "We are alive. Help us." But how could that be? The crash had happened in 1991. The wreck was found in 2016. Whoever wrote it had done so in those desperate final hours. Yet, there were no bodies, no skeletons, no sign of the 200 souls who had boarded Flight 702. Theories exploded across the media. Some claimed local tribes had rescued or captured the survivors. Others believed the government cover-up had buried the truth for decades. Families demanded answers. The Indonesian and Australian governments pointed fingers at each other. Meanwhile, in the jungle, investigators dug deeper. The black box gave more clues. Hours before the crash, the cockpit voice recorder captured muffled shouting and pounding on the locked door. At one point, a voice with a heavy accent demanded the plane change course north, away from its destination. Then, the chilling final words of Captain Richard Hall. "If we go down, we go down together." The plane had veered hundreds of miles off its planned route before disappearing from radar. Satellite analysis confirmed that its final descent was deliberate, guided, not random, which meant, wherever they landed, someone had chosen this jungle as their grave. Inside the wreckage, investigators uncovered more disturbing evidence. Crates in the cargo hold, unmarked, still sealed. When opened, they revealed military-grade weapons, rifles, ammunition, and radio equipment. This was not supposed to be on a civilian passenger flight. The revelation fueled a shocking theory. Flight 702 wasn't just a passenger plane. It was being used to smuggle weapons during a volatile political conflict. And someone, perhaps the hijackers, knew. But what about the passengers? That answer came from a discovery miles away from the crash site. A villager from a remote Papuan settlement came forward. He was a child in 1991, but he remembered the night clearly. He spoke of hundreds of strangers marching through the jungle, led by armed men. Exhausted, injured, barefoot, but alive. They stayed for weeks in makeshift camps, guarded, before being forced deeper into the wilderness. And then nothing. The villagers never saw them again. For 25 years, the fate of those 200 people remained buried in silence. But now it was clear they had survived the crash, and their disappearance was no accident. Someone had erased them. As investigators pieced together the fragments, a picture began to form, one that was darker than anyone had imagined. Flight 702 had been hijacked, not by random terrorists, but by a well-organized group with ties to an international arms ring. The unmarked crates in the cargo hold were the key. Intelligence reports declassified years later confirmed it. The flight had been secretly transporting weapons, disguised as commercial cargo. Most of the passengers never knew. They were pawns in a game they hadn't agreed to play. But why crash the plane into the jungle? The answer came from the cockpit recorder. Hidden in the static after the captain's last words was a faint but chilling message, whispered in panic. They don't want survivors. Theories hardened into a terrifying reality. The passengers had indeed survived the initial crash, but survival wasn't part of the plan. They had witnessed something they were never meant to see. Teams scoured the jungle for evidence, and what they found was worse than the families had feared. A clearing, overgrown with vines, where makeshift shelters once stood. Charred remains of fires. Scattered belongings. Children's shoes, rusted wristwatches, scraps of clothing, signs of a camp hastily abandoned. DNA analysis confirmed that at least some of the passengers had lived for weeks after crash. But where they went, or what was done to them, remained the haunting question. Whispers began to circulate among investigators. Stories of a ghost convoy spotted in the early 90s, armed men escorting civilians through mountain passes, only to disappear into secret facilities. Documents leaked from intelligence archives suggested that the passengers had been taken, not killed in the crash, but removed, hidden, silenced. Why? Because their survival threatened to expose an illegal weapons operation that involved powerful players. The crash was never an accident. It was a cover-up. 25 years later, the jungle had given up its secret, but the truth of what happened to those 200 people was darker than the silence that kept it buried. They hadn't died in the crash. They had been erased. When the investigation results were finally released, the world was shaken. Flight 702 had not been lost to bad weather or mechanical failure. It had been hijacked, diverted, and used as a pawn in a shadow war of smuggled weapons and political secrets. For the families, the truth was a knife that cut both ways. Closure at last, but also confirmation of the nightmare they had feared. Their loved ones had survived the crash, only to vanish into silence. A memorial was built at the crash site in Papua, a wall of names, etched into steel, standing among the vines and trees that had hidden the plane for 25 years. Families traveled from across the world to touch those names, to weep where the jungle had swallowed their past. Some brought photos. Others brought toys, letters, flowers. A mother knelt in the mud and whispered, "I knew you lived. I knew you waited." But the legacy of Flight 702 didn't end in sorrow. The revelation sparked outrage on a global scale. Governments that had once denied involvement were forced to face the truth. Laws were passed tightening international air cargo regulations. New systems of satellite tracking ensured that no plane could ever vanish so completely again. Yet, in the end, no law, no policy could erase the human cost. 200 souls stolen by secrecy. 200 families broken by silence. In one of the final press conferences, the daughter of a missing passenger, now grown, a woman in her 30s, stood before cameras, her voice steady but her eyes burning. For 25 years, they tried to bury the truth, but the truth does not rot. It waits. Just like the jungle kept the plane, time kept the story. And now the world knows our families mattered, our voices mattered, and they always will. As the sun set over the crash site, the vines rustling in the wind, the memorial stood tall, a reminder that no lie lasts forever, no disappearance stays hidden, and that even after decades of silence, the truth will always claw its way to surface. And in that silence, as families placed flowers on the wreckage, it was said you could almost hear it, the echo of voices long gone, passengers who had waited to be found. Not cries of despair, but whispers of endurance. They were alive. They mattered. And now, finally, the world remembers. Stories like this remind us that the truth always comes out, no matter how long it hides. If you want more unbelievable mysteries like Flight 702, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next.